extended to the tropical veldt and grassland. We migrated across the deserts of the Near and Middle East, which were not so desertous at that time, but we also were able to cross the Himalayas. We exist in the Arctic, in the rainforest. We exist at the level of the Witoto or the modern New Yorker. We are adaptable. And this is what has kept our options open. And this is what I think we have to recognize and conserve. And the psychedelics do that. The psychedelics are, to my mind, although people have actually argued this with me, although it seemed really incontrovertible to me, that they are deconditioning agents, that they make you question what Marxist, Mormon, whatever you are. If you take psychedelics, you will ask questions that cannot be answered within the paradigm in which you were brought up. And that's important because all of these social systems are only means to the next level of ascent. What we see in the Soviet Union today is a hang-up. They have an ideology which allows no means to the next level of ascent. They are caught forever in the Hegelian dialectic. There's no escape. It's hopeless. And so they have occupied an evolutionary niche very successfully. But now what are they going to do? And every society is confronted with this because every society erects institutions which try to freeze the historical process. It's almost as though we are continuously calcifying, and yet we must not let that happen. I think it was Ludwig von Bertalanffy who said human beings are not machines, but in every situation, given their own will, they will behave like machines, fall into routines, and just cease to examine what is in front of them. So I think that the psychedelic thing is very important. I'm sorry to see it. It's clouded. It's a murky picture. I don't see. I think people should do more of it and reflect, and that there should be much less missionary work. That the goal is not to get as many people stoned as possible. The goal is to make sure that everybody who gets stoned gets really stoned, so that we don't have a bunch of confusion about just exactly what we're talking about.
No nibblers.
I mean, I meet people who the only drug they have ever taken is MDMA. And we're trying to have a conversation about the nature of the psychedelic cosmology. It's weird sledding, you know. Okay, cybernetics, psychedelics, space is the other one. And I see all of these things as just completely one thing. And as I said this morning, I think the difference between Jose and I, one difference is that he is interested in creating a planetary consciousness out of the surrender of the ego of individuals to this higher vision of what should happen. I think that there already is this superhuman organism, and that our freedom is largely illusory. We are all moving to the tune of what Freud called the superego, what I call the overmind, because I don't like the notion of superego is a little torchlight parades and that sort of thing. But the overmind, the notion of simply a control mechanism, which is almost cybernetic, but which is leading everything forward and actually is orchestrating what is happening, so that all of these human groups which aspire to hegemony, you know, Wall Street, the Communist Party, the Zionists, you name it, they are all frustrated because there seems to be an invisible impeding force against their machinations and their vision of how things should be. And no matter how many guns they pile up, no matter how much propaganda they churn out, the historical continuum has a way of stabbing them in the back and surprising them endlessly. This is, I think, because they are fools playing with a master, which is the superego. And until this, and what we as individuals can do is help that process by not participating in the projections of anxiety that these various factions are pushing, that arise out of their frustration with their inability to get a handle on things. I don't want them to run things, Wall Street or the Communist Party or anybody. I think that it works very nicely that it is run invisibly from the unconscious. I think it was Charles Fort who said, there comes steam engine time, and then there will be steam engines. And and that is what is happening with modern technology, even to the point of the atomic bomb. I am willing to explore the notion that the atomic bomb has been a wonderful force for cohering people's minds around the question of planetary survival. That if we had come out of World War II with aerial bombing and mustard gas, but nothing quite horrifying enough to shock people awake, I think it's remarkable that we have lived in such a stable world since 1945, that it has never, only once, was it used against a human population. And my God, think of the hatred and the loathing that is loose on this planet. And yet the bomb has sobered people. And every political movement for social cohesion and enlightenment that is post-1945 has built its rhetoric around the bomb. The peace movement, to some degree, the hippies, the existential response of the Beat generation, all of these rich cultural phenomena have been reflections on the bomb. So the bomb is good. The thing that is important is not to use it. Then it becomes a problem. I think that this thing that has broken about nuclear winter is very interesting. But capitalism is very interested in making money. A decimated Earth is not good real estate. And I think that the nuclear winter issue is the beginning of the end of the nuclear log jam. That because the Soviet Academy of Sciences conducted an independent study, they reached the same conclusion. The people who were skeptical of Sagan and the others, they researched it, they reached the same conclusion. War is obsolete. And this is actually understood by the people who frighten us the most. I really think that they have come to see it as a bad deal and no moneymaker. And in that case, there will be change. The novelty wave is affecting all of these institutions. The strategies are changing at the very topmost level because it's no good to have a no-win situation. So, and as far as the space travel thing is concerned, I really think that inner and outer space are the same thing, and that we will come to understand this through research on psychedelics, that when the ayahuasquero in the Peruvian Amazon tells you he goes to the Milky Way, he is not really kidding. You see, no matter how radical we are in our assumptions, it's very hard to not assume that we don't at least have 95% of the picture. I mean, for instance, we believe in things like elementary particles and well, these things may be no closer to the mark than the notion that the world was created when the ant king got out of his canoe at the second waterfall to take a leak. You know, these may be preposterous notions. The polite approach that is usually taken is to say, well, everybody has a bit of the piece. The Mayans had a bit of the piece. The Buddhists, they know something. Those Sufis, they're pretty sharp. The mushrooms suggested that nobody has a piece of the action, that it's all wrong. It's all completely 100% bullshit, you see? And that's a very cleansing notion to begin to explore, to return to ground zero and start out with how radical a deconstruction can we carry on with this world? What is the real nature of language? This is what all of these fine theories leave out. It's what mine leaves out. It's what Jose's leaves out. It's that, what is this phenomenon called language, where by making little mouth noises, we coax roughly congruent notions into each other's brains and then gabble joyfully over this achievement, you know? Reality is not made of electrons or quarks or any of these things. It is clearly made of language. And all of these abstractions, the faceless myths that were mentioned this morning, are totally naive about language. They just view it like a fish views water. It's good to speak clearly, that's important. But other than that, they haven't a word to say about the epistemic basis of language. Science is most guilty of this because science is a very old institution. Consequently, its most fundamental assumptions were carried out in the atmosphere of greatest epistemological naivete. Things like that the universe is knowable at all. Things like that induction is a good way to think. Induction is when you say, well, if it happened 10 times, it'll probably happen the 11th time. Probably. There's a loaded word that science is very big on. So the real revolution is to come, I think, in language, and the way in which psychedelics and feminism and cybernetics all come together is that we each need to carry out a very basic analysis of what we think about language and what we think it is and what we think it does. For instance, I've noticed, and this may be because I'm male, but I've noticed that there are all these things flying around which can't be discussed. And I finally realized that they're emotions, is what they are. And that we have a very, very limited vocabulary of emotions. We experience an amazingly rich interior gradient of shifting modalities, of which we never can say. You say, I like you, I don't like you, I'm uncomfortable, I really feel weird. This is just like, petroglyphs about emotion. Ralph Metzner and I have been playing with the idea that there is and certainly Robert Graves and other people have preceded us in this, but that there is hardwired into the human brain a kind of language that is older than agreed upon dictionaries, that is, in fact, to hear it is to understand it. The problem is the only thing it can convey are emotions. But the emotions that it can convey are so finely graded and so rich in their adumbrations and resonances that it's like a form of magic. And we call this glossolalia and classify it as a subpsychotic or near psychotic phenomenon, brain origin uncertain, cultural use uncertain, so forth and so on. Ralph and I have even toyed with the notion of holding weekends where we would insist that every rationally apprehendable utterance be followed by an utterance which was not rationally apprehendable. The non-rationally apprehendable utterance would anchor you in the emotional gestalt of the moment. And that would be like the carrier wave, which... Do it? I thought you'd never ask. Estidi me hiedgwa hwa waktikapidiking et ed mizedge jegwa kwam bedegve aktan. Edidige me heng bekwa
I've had a conversation like this with a Sufi in Sudan, and it was amazing to me because there was a third person there who could translate exactly
what is being conveyed once you get used to it is the anchoring and the gestaltung of the emotional moment.
And this man was reading my emotions to a finer level, the one who was translating. Then, I mean, I recognized what he was saying, but it was accurate about the mood that was being conveyed.
That's right. You discover these things on psychedelics, but they are clearly subject to creodization, in other words, to being learned, that you can lay down these pathways in the brain, and it's marvelous.
I think this is fundamental to language learning anyway, because this is how the child learns, and how you learn when you're in a foreign country. You don't study from a book. You understand long before you can speak.
That's right.
You don't know what's being said.
That's
but
right.
You do come to understand.
You can pick it up.
And the child is always spoken to in terms which are way above anything. It's verbal comprehension, but it understands it well.
So we need to learn to be able to create these linguistic constructs which are not meaning tied, but which communicate. One of the most interesting things about psilocybin is that on high doses, this asynesthesia takes place, where when you articulate in this emotional glossolalia, you actually can condense objects which are beheld. In other words, you take control of the mechanism of the hallucinations, and you create these toy-like, jewel-like, self-transforming grammatical complexes. You're speaking some kind of translinguistic language, which is beheld rather than heard. And Philo Judaeus talked about the more perfect logos, and he said the more perfect logos will be beheld rather than heard, but it will pass from being heard to being beheld without ever crossing over a discernible barrier of transition. And I have experienced this, and I think other people have, where you hear the glossolalia like wave, and it comes closer and closer, and then at a certain point, it is manifest as a topology. And I think many of the psychedelics communicate in these visual languages. After taking ayahuasca, and sitting with these people in darkened huts in the Amazon, after hours and hours of it, your eyes are just bugging out of your head. You just have spent hours looking and looking and looking and drinking in this visual data. And this is how really dense information is conveyed, not a linear string of little mouth noises where the brain rushes to the conventionalized dictionary and then grimly reconstructs the intention, provided nothing too finely sculpted was intended. And I think what's happening with the monitoring of brain states. Ralph Abraham, who was here this morning, is the director of the Visual Mathematics Project at Santa Cruz. Glossolalia, language, drugs, cybernetics, all of these things are the means to transforming the human self-image. It's almost impossible to imagine what a society would be like where this glossolalia held sway equal with speech. I think the pre-Celtic people, the Celts of Ireland, may have been into this because they rarely spoke without punning, and you were expected to pun on multiple levels. And the pun, far from being trivial, is a step toward this hyperdimensional linguistic construct. It's almost like a fractal. A pun is a word with 1.5 dimensions or more in it. And it resonates. This historical, this vision that I conveyed this morning of the co-presence of resonant epochs in time could only be conveyed if someone could transform their language in such a way that it was implicit that this was happening, and we were all noticing it and experiencing it the way we are noticing and experiencing the greenness of this tree, the fall of the sunlight through the leaves. We could also be experiencing the ebb and flow of middle of Mesopotamian empires and Hellenistic religions and so forth and so on.